After taking Aachen, 1st Army needed to await the massive buildup of supplies and reinforcements needed to take the bridges over the Rhine and then fight on to the next objective, the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. But Adolf Hitler had another card up his sleeve. On 16 December 1944, the enemy launched a massive counterattack. 3 field armies, over 200,000 men, at a thinly held sector of 1st Army's line in the Belgian Ardennes. The enemy achieved complete surprise. Green units fell back or were overrun or captured in the initial assault. The German objective was Antwerp. With its important seaport, its capture would split the Anglo-American allies in two and deliver this logistical lifeline into the Führer's shaky hands. Task Force Hogan was alerted and ordered to disengage from their advanced positions in Germany and double back into Belgium with the objective of Houffalize. The task force was down to 1/3 of their available tanks. To help mitigate the lack of infantry as well as shortage of tanks, Major General Rose plussed up Task Force Hogan with 1 company of scouts, 1 section of anti-aircraft artillery, and 1 battery of self-propelled howitzers. After an all-night march towards the objective, with V-1 flying bombs pulsing overhead on their way to destroy Allied supply dumps, they arrived at La Roche with fuel tanks half full and no planned resupply. Little did they know that La Roche lay smack dab in the path of the 116th Panzer Division, who had already overrun elements of the U.S. 7th Armored. Sam Hogan decided to occupy the town and send out an early morning reconnaissance element to identify the location of the German line. The reconnaissance element was composed of 3 jeeps and included Hogan's, Major Brown, his S3, and Lieutenant Whirl, his recon platoon leader. Upon turning a curve, they encountered a half-track with Germans dressed as Americans, who immediately opened fire. Sam and his element evaded into the woods as their vehicles stalled. For the next 12 hours, they searched the friendly lines, while Task Force Hogan fought off repeated attacks. By the time the half-frozen command element had rejoined its unit, Task Force Hogan had been pushed back to the vicinity of Beth. Without infantry to scan the woods, the road-bound tanks were vulnerable and were soon surrounded by enemy infantry. A running battle ensued as Task Force Hogan began running out of fuel. They occupied the small hilltop village of Marcouray, with its stone houses and lines of sight towards enemy approaches, as well as the ability to maintain radio communications. The Americans were for now in a safe place, and they began to dig in order to fend off any German attacks and help stymie their advance toward the Meuse. On top of the shortages of fuel and ammunition, the 17 wounded men in the task force required medical supplies and immediate evacuation. Despite the secure perimeter, on the morning of 23 December, Sam stepped out of his command post to the heart-stopping sight of 2 enemy 8-wheeled armored scout cars loaded with infantry roaring past his command post. Overcoming the initial shock, Sam raced back into his command post to radio the tank checkpoints at the bottom of the hill. The other checkpoint's tank had its turret freeze solid overnight, and they were unable to fire at the incoming enemy patrol. After a short, sharp engagement, a Sherman destroyed the enemy patrol and captured several German prisoners. After the short battle, medical supplies were becoming critical and the task force needed fuel. On Christmas Eve, a German officer arrived under a flag of truce to demand a surrender. Sam Hogan, dragging on cigarettes, calmly declined, stating that he had orders to fight to the death. Also on the 24th, a last attempt at aerial resupply by parachute was conducted. 200 gallons of fuel drifted into enemy lines, an unfortunate navigation error that also resulted in several C-47s shot down. 2 U.S. aviators miraculously made it to the Task Force Hogan lines and settled in for the siege after receiving a bit of food. With all available units engaged in breaking through to the 101st Airborne Division 20 miles south of Bastogne, Task Force Hogan was on their own. Artillery kept coming in, and the duels were becoming harder and harder. On Christmas morning, Major General Maurice Rose ordered the unit to destroy their tanks and make their way to friendly lines on foot. Engines were run with sugar in the fuel tanks till they seized up. Heavy weapons were destroyed and tires slashed with bayonets. The 400 soldiers camouflaged their faces and prepared to march out at dusk on Christmas night. In groups of 8 to 10, they began to trudge west towards friendly lines at Soie. Led by scouts with no flashlights and nothing to guide them but the stars and luminous compasses, they marched up and down ridges, through streams and woods blanketed with snow and ice. At 3 a.m., Scout Sergeant Lee Porter froze as a German sentry called out a challenge. Thinking fast, the nimble scout sprinted behind the enemy guard, covered his mouth with his left hand as he sunk his bayonet quietly into his vitals with his right. They had escaped from being discovered, only barely.
Men of Task Force Hogan, who fought off a crack SS division, refused to surrender, and finally, when their supplies are gone, walked 14 miles back through the enemy lines. The defiant GIs blackened their faces, and on Christmas night made their getaway.
What you just saw was the wartime footage of Task Force Hogan taken as they returned to friendly lines at the town of Soie. Major General Maurice Rose and Sam Hogan exchanged at the end. When the general asked Sam why he was the last man out, the latter replied, "My feet hurt." As for Staff Sergeant Lee Porter, the scout on point that took out the sentry, he received the British Military Medal for Gallantry from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery himself. As for the Task Force Hogan wounded, they attempted to move out in the early morning under the flag of the Red Cross. Captain Louis Spiegelman and Staff Sergeant Ryan Kuderka insisted on staying behind with them. They were all taken prisoner and survived the war. So is this the end of the Task Force Hogan story? Not by a long shot. Within a week, they received new tanks and equipment and went on the offensive to push back the Bulge. Interested in this content? Go ahead and follow, comment, and share.